Hey, this is Carl. Before we get started, I want to make a request of you. If you feel that our little podcast in an even more little corner of the internet has improved the quality of your life, will you please go right now to donate.2keto.com and support our efforts with a pledge of $10 a month. You probably spend more than that on coffee or Netflix. Where do you rank 2 Keto Dudes in the list of things that bring you joy? 2 Keto Dudes has always been an edited show. We don't want to just turn on the recorders and post everything warts and all on YouTube. That's why our guests like to be on the show. So that costs us money for audio engineers to edit our shows and a professional hosting service to keep our shows online. Plus, we can say whatever we want and not have to worry about YouTube taking down our content.
Ivermectin! Sorry, furball.
We hope to keep the show free of advertising. So that is why this show has always been listener-funded. How can you help? Please go to donate.2keto.com right now. And thank you.
Hydroxychloroquine! Sorry, my hives were playing up. Hi, I'm Richard Morris from Canberra, Australia. In 2014, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. After taking the dietary advice from the Australian Diabetes Association, I became more diabetic. I did some research, which led me to the ketogenic diet. Spoiler alert, I reversed my type 2 diabetes by drastically reducing my carbohydrate intake and increasing my consumption of healthy fats. In 2016, I was determined to help my buddy Carl by showing him what I did and the science behind it.
Hey, that's me. I'm Carl Franklin from the United States. I also used to be a type 2 diabetic, but not as severely as Richard. I devoured all that information Richard sent me, and after a mutual friend went keto to address prostate cancer, I also went on the ketogenic diet. That was in February of 2016. By April, I was in full swing reversing my diabetes.
We're not doctors and we don't give medical advice. We're just a couple of dudes on the internet who reverse their diabetes by following a ketogenic diet.
And we just want to share our experiences and what we know about the science behind the ketogenic diet.
Yeah, so we started this podcast to chronicle Carl's journey and to provide solid information to people who are curious about this dietary lifestyle.
Right. And now we have over 200 podcast episodes, some of which have been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. And also, after epically failing on Facebook, we moved our online community to the ketogenic forums, where tens of thousands of people now share their experiences.
We also founded an annual ketogenic festival called Keto Fest. Carl and I are both software developers, so we found ourselves at software conferences several times a year, and we tend to gravitate towards those conversations that happen in the hallways at conferences. Sure, the talks are great, but it's a community that we enjoy the most.
Right. So Keto Fest is a conference to discuss the latest research of the ketogenic diet, and it's also a festival celebrating the ketogenic lifestyle. And you're going to want to stay tuned for news about the next Keto Fest.
So, Carl, what is a ketogenic diet?
I don't know.
It's about time you finally admitted it.
Sorry.
Leave that in. Just to prove that we actually have editors.
I just wanted to say that. It's a diet where instead of burning sugar and starch for energy, our cells preferentially burn fat. That produces molecules called ketones that our bodies use for fuel.
Right. Our main molecular fuels are glucose, which we make from carbohydrates, and fatty acids, which we make from fat. Our cells have two modes. In one, they burn glucose and make fat, and in the other, they burn fatty acids and make ketones.
But you don't have to eat a high-fat diet to be ketogenic, right?
Well, when you're starting out, you may have to, and then in a few weeks, as you become better adapted to burning fat for energy, when all of your calories come from fatty acids, the amount that you need to eat becomes coupled to satiety, which integrates not only the variable amount of energy your body needs to run every day, but also the amount of fat that can be drawn down from storage.
So how many carbs do we need to restrict ourselves to in order to get into that state?
It depends. Some of us who are metabolically disordered may need to get below 20 grams a day. Someone who is quite metabolically flexible can probably eat as much as 100 grams a day.
How about other things like protein, minerals, and essential cofactors like vitamins and essential fats?
Well, you need 1 to 1.5 grams of protein for every kilo of lean mass, and beyond that, you just waste excess by turning it into energy instead of using fatty acids. As for other essential nutrients, if you're eating fatty meats or eggs, plus a few leafy green vegetables, then you'll get most of those because the organisms that made those foods have already concentrated essential cofactors.
Ketogenic diets are varied and delicious. They can be vegetarian or carnivore, home-cooked or takeout, hot cuisine, or just bacon and eggs.
As long as your carbohydrates are low enough.
And if you're an absolute beginner, check out our Starting Keto podcast for more information at start.2keto.com. So how you been, Richard?
Yeah, doing well. Lockdown's over, and the dog got to go to doggy daycare, so he was very happy about that. And just working in the lab, the usual stuff. Did a couple of podcasts and did some presentations, but other than that,
cooking anything delicious tonight?
I don't know what the plans are for tonight because I've got to go out shopping for meats for my because we're out of meat. We've only got frozen stuff, so I want fresh. So what I'll do is I'll go out and I'll find a meat that stimulates me, and I will cook a meal around it.
That's the way to do it, man.
It's easy peasy, isn't it? Once you learn to cook, cooking is the secret sauce. Once you learn to cook, you can reverse diabetes. So
it sure is, man. You can't just skate through the keto diet without getting in the kitchen and getting your hands dirty.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
How about you, Carl? How was your week?
Well, speaking of cooking, this is a great weekend for me. And by the time everybody hears this, it'll be over. But I'm doing a keto mini fest tomorrow. We're recording this Friday night, my time. So it's the Saturday, the 23rd. And it's a Portuguese theme this time. I went to Porto, I believe it was in 2018, to do a software conference there. And I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the food and the wine. The wine is just so good and so plentiful and affordable. And they just make it right there. They don't export a lot of it. So I remember going to a local grocery store and getting some exceptional charcuterie and like a €3 bottle of wine that was amazing.
€3.
€3,
not
yeah,
3 year old. €3.
€3, yeah. So $5.
$5, yeah.
Unbelievable. So anyway, the theme is Portuguese food and music. We're gonna have fado music playing. So this is what I'm making: chorizo, and the Portuguese chorizo I get is from Fall River, where Emeril Lagasse hails from. And the big Portuguese community there's a little shop, and they get their chorizo locally. And I got this Azorean cheese. It's made on the island of Terceira in the Azores, which is administered by Portugal. So I'm going to make some queso, some cheese sauce with that.
Nice.
Yeah, and I'm going to cube up the chorizo, fry it up in butter and, toothpicks and gobs of that cheese, and it's going to be a nice little appetizer. Also, in Portugal, they love grilled fish everywhere, and sardines are the thing. Sardines, a sardine isn't a type of fish, actually. It's a category of fish. So they usually are 8-9 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches tall. And the way to cook them is just salt on a charcoal grill. You don't even need any oil because they're oily fish.
How difficult is that?
It's
is
the easiest, delicious food you've ever had. So I'm also making cod croquettes.
Okay.
This is the first time I've ever made fish croquettes, but I've made fish cakes. So it's not really different, just shaped into balls. Also, Portuguese love hot chicken. You think Nashville has got hot chicken, the corner, but Portugal has been making this sort of piri-piri chicken for a long time. And piri-piri is like an African pepper oil. So it's very hot, and I'm using Thai bird chilies for that. So those will be chicken thighs, essentially like baked chicken thighs with a hot sauce. And also caldo viejo, which is a chicken stock-based soup that has kale and linguiça. And that should be a lot of fun. So this is what I'm doing. After we record this, I'm literally going out to the kitchen to start prepping for tomorrow. And that's it. So here's what I propose, because I think we're going to be talking to Nina for a long time. So I say we forego mail and recipes.
I'm up for that. Yeah.
And let's just spend more time with Nina.
So in case you haven't realized, Nina Teicholz is our guest today.
That's right. And she's on the line right now. Hi, Nina. Welcome back to Two Keto Dudes.
Hello, Carl Franklin.
Good day, Nina.
Hello. Good day.
How are you on this fine morning in New York?
I'm well. It's a beautiful fall morning, and I've been out walking my dog, and so
doing all those things.
Yeah. How about you all?
Spring.
It's been a long time.
And I've been walking my dog. So
walking our dog for a couple of years.
You don't have a dog. Is that what you're saying?
I don't. But, we haven't spoken in a couple of years, and things have happened.
It's amazing how long it's been.
2018, June. In New York, we spoke. Was the last time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there have been get-togethers and conferences. I don't know if either of you have been to any of them. But I haven't been back into the scene, I guess, since March 2019.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not since the plague hit us. The last conference I went to was in Denver in 2020, March.
And you got the last flight out, right?
Yeah. The last flight back to Australia, pretty much.
Oh, sorry, 2020, right. Oh, right. That was the conference, the dubious conference where the criticized conference that how dare you head into the eye of the COVID storm and hold a conference when everybody was fleeing out.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of anybody. Yeah, nobody got coronavirus at the conference, as far as I'm aware. So,
well, getting dates and times confused is the first sign that you have COVID.
Right. They didn't know they had COVID. So,
anyway.
Yeah. So, and things are a little bit worse over in Australia in terms of lockdown, right?
We came out of lockdown on Friday, but we have nothing much really has changed for us. Pretty much everybody is working from home if they can until probably end of December. But we have 99% first shot vaccination and 82% second shot. So in my state, so we're pretty close to. We'll be 90% by the end of the month.
Yeah, you guys do it right. Just
I don't know about that.
Get it. Well,
we got lucky.
The approach is different, right? Than here. I mean, it's like, all right, shut everything down. We'll bite the bullet for a few weeks or whatever. Everybody will comply, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not like the U.S. didn't have lockdown. The U.S. did have lockdown. So, anyway, and I'm one of those people that happens to think that lockdown has a lot of, does quite a bit of harm. So it should not be the first course of action.
Yeah.
It was never not going to do harm. It's the relative of not locking down and letting it rip. So,
well, I just read an article, speaking of the harms, and also probably the topic that we could talk about is, one of the things that happened, I don't know if it happened so much in Australia, but in the US, there's just been people gained a lot of weight. The amount of weight they gained was, I think on average, around 25 pounds on average. And that includes kids. So obesity rates really rose dramatically. And I just read a new study out that shows, this is not the first time. There's been many studies that have shown how much dramatically worse COVID is for people with overweight or obesity.
Yeah.
Particularly obesity. It's like they're much more likely to get COVID. They're much more likely to have terrible symptoms. They're much more likely to end up in the hospital or die. And it's, and actually more tightly correlated with all those negative outcomes is high blood sugars. So HbA1c is the most
uncontrolled diabetes.
Well, I mean, right. We know that that's associated with, with metabolic disease generally. So
I think the one of the first studies that came out of Wuhan showed the highest correlation was uncontrolled diabetes and wearing eyeglasses. And the theory was, I never really understood the eyeglasses thing. It was something about catching droplets on your eyes. If you wore glasses, there was a significant protection. Because everyone was wearing masks because it's a polluted city. So they were wearing masks from the get-go. So their exposure was via droplets in their eyes. And so, but type 2 diabetes was really from the get-go. We knew type 2 diabetes was going to be a significant cofactor. Or a significant,
I heard that about the eyes. That the eyes were the main way that you get COVID.
The whistleblower, the whistleblower in Wuhan who first started talking about this was an ophthalmologist who got it from a patient, staring, looking through his device at their eyes and up close and personal, and presumably they had to take off their mask and he,
interesting.
Yeah, so he died.
So we should all be wearing glasses, not masks.
But the other thing is that there was that press release from Virta. They haven't done a study about it. I suggested to them 2 years ago in 2020 that they should be looking at this in their cohort of Sarah Hallberg's people. But they did a press release on the difference between the type 2 diabetics that they managed and the type 2 diabetics that I can't remember, was it Henry Ford Group Hospital? Anyway, there was another large group of similar type 2 diabetics, and the difference in the mortality rates between the two was remarkable. So it's not just, being diabetic is bad, but if you can control your diabetes, if you can control your diabetes specifically here through a ketogenic diet, the rates of death and hospitalisation were almost the same as the general population of non-diabetics. So,
and yet, I don't know about in Australia, but in the U.S., there's absolutely no conversation about trying to lose weight, improve metabolic health, control blood sugar, cut back on sugary, starchy foods as an intervention, as a preventive intervention to make people more resilient to COVID. Nothing. And then if you were to object, say, to one of the more absurd things was Krispy Kreme, which is a donut chain, handing out, first one, I think then it was 2 donuts if you got your vaccine shot. If you were to criticize that, then that puts you.
How dare you?
Well, it was just, I remember just getting criticized or seeing criticism about, it's just, it's everything in moderation. And how can you be critical of something that seems so fun? And there was, in fact, one of the members of the U.S. Dietary Guideline Committee from the last go around holding her box of Krispy Kreme saying, hey, this is such a great thing on her Twitter feed. So I think, so I'm so disappointed that this factor that has clearly gotten worse. So we're less resilient to the virus now. In fact, one of the reasons the Delta variant maybe have hit children harder is that children have gained so much weight now, that there's really not any conversation about it. I don't think I've heard the words obesity or diabetes, or heart disease come out of the mouths of any of our, our leading politicians.
Or even vitamin D, Nina.
Right.
That's something the rest of
vitamin D.
Yeah, the rest of the world understands vitamin D.
Yeah. We have we've got guidance for keeping nutritionally complete. There's no reason to be deficient in vitamin D, we were told. The other thing was that we had fairly harsh lockdowns in Victoria where which was kind of the epicenter of, it was kind of our New York, in the early phase, you were limited. You couldn't go more than 5 kilometers from your home. And the only reason that you could go out, there were only 2 reasons to go out. One is to get fresh food, so you can go to supermarkets to buy food, or you can't visit family, you can't go to schools or work or anything like that, unless you're an essential worker. So the 2 carve-outs were, you're allowed to go out to the supermarket to buy fresh food, and you're allowed an hour outside to exercise, but you had to wear your mask unless it was vigorous. If you were running or cycling, you didn't have to wear a mask, but which is it's kind of antithetical, because, if somebody's running and heavy breathing, they're going to be, producing more droplets, presumably, but still, they're moving quickly through an area. They're not ambling slowly through an area. But so there were carve-outs for the lockdown restrictions, specifically for trying to make sure that people don't get too obese, from eating takeaway food and not exercising. So there was that, I guess. Right.
But I mean, I think we all know the extent to which being depressed and bored plays a role in overeating, and we're all home and not having contact with your friends or family is depressing. Yes. It just is depressing. I mean, I was able to to spend my lockdown in a lovely house in Connecticut, surrounded by forests and fields, and go out walking. And actually the state of Connecticut was relatively, Carl, you can confirm for me your experience, but I mean, it was just relatively calm. The kids stayed in school.
Yeah.
There weren't a lot of cases in the area where I live. There was just not a lot of, people were not wearing masks that much. People were getting together and having, little small parties.
Yeah, we had a bubble, a family bubble.
And nobody got sick. I mean, it was, I think, less intense than what other people suffered. But even so, the relative isolation that I felt, and I know other people felt, I mean, and the fact of just being home all day, you're right next to the kitchen.
Yeah.
It's just, and you may or may not be with people that you want to spend as much time with. If you have that much time with, if you have children, they're stressed out going to school online. So all of that those were big stressors. We couldn't order out dinner the way we used to. So anyway, I think that's, those are the main reasons people eat. They're stressed and they're bored. They're isolated. They're not socializing.
I think I put on about 5 kilos, but the nice thing about being keto is you can. So I'm down 45 kilos from my maximum weight. I did get down to 50, and then I put 5 back on. But the nice thing about being keto is that you can get fat on a ketogenic diet, but you're not going to get as fat as you will on a high-carb diet. And in my case, the difference is about 45 kilos, which is quite a significant amount of weight, and quite significant health impact of carrying that weight. So, it's if you're ketogenic, you really have to cook for yourself, because it's very difficult to eat out and get ketogenic food. So it was kind of nice little ketogenic bubble for me, at least, It was survivable. I can't imagine what it would be like if I didn't cook, and if I was going out every day to get takeout, and I would have been a mess.
It'd be hard. I put on half the weight I lost too.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people learned to make sourdough. Sourdough bread. Apparently, that was a thing during the lockdown. So I wonder if they also took the opportunity to take cooking lessons.
Yeah.
It's just one of the things you could do at home. So, we did, I mean, we did a lot of, we just grilled.
Yeah.
That was mainly our cooking. But I put on a few pounds myself.
I got good at certain areas of software development. I had a lot of time to do research and made that work for me.
That's good.
Yeah.
What can you do now?
We didn't have Keto Fest last year or the year before that, actually, for a different reason. But we're going to do it next year. And this is the announcement.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So we have
That's
a
good.
website right now at ketofest.com just to collect names and email addresses of those who are interested. And we've got a few people who have said yes. I'm looking at one of them right now.
I'll be there.
Yeah. And it's going to be in October 2022.
Assuming the Australian government allows me to fly out of the country, I'm going to be there as well.
Yeah. I mean, I have a similar problem, Richard. I'm supposed to be speaking in Norway at the end of the year. And right now, American citizens aren't allowed into the EU.
Wow.
American citizens aren't allowed?
Yeah, I think from what I read, you can't. They'll turn you away at the airport,
even if you're vaccinated.
Even if you're vaccinated, Canadians can get in, but right now they don't want any U.S. people.
Sorry, when did that happen? I went to Greece this summer.
It was August 30th that the United States was removed from the European Union's approved list of countries for entry. Only a little more than 2 months after it had finally been added to the list, and now they're back to letting Americans in. So,
oh, good.
So,
I think there was a certain amount of tit for tat on that because the U.S. had not been allowing people in.
Well, anyway.
So, well, that's good. So you can go to Norway.
So now I can go to Norway.
That's good. What are you going to speak about?
It's a software conference. So I'm going to speak about how expensive everything is. Starbucks coffee is $14 or something. It's crazy.
No. In Norway?
Yeah. For two?
Well, they got pretty much universal basic income there. So, I mean, the people of Norway own their oil.
Yes.
That's how that works.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Teslas are the most popular sports car.
100% of their cars are electric. That's the first world problems right there.
Right. Exactly. So, Richard, what's your research? What have you been doing?
So I graduated my degree in biochemistry. I went back for more damage and got an honours degree in computational chemistry. I'm a co-author on a paper examining the biophysical properties of the epithelial membrane. So I'm a published peer-reviewed scientist now, which is cool.
Congratulations!
Thank you very much.
And you did get you got your PhD with honors.
Not my PhD, right? My undergraduate with honors.
Oh, your undergraduate with honors. Okay.
And now I'm starting a PhD. So,
okay. All right.
But it gives me a platform. At least now I'm a biochemist, a peer-reviewed, published biochemist. So there's that.
Excellent. So what is can you explain your paper in lay terms?
So you'd probably be interested in the one I'm working on right now, which was the subject of my honours degree. And that is the biophysical properties of the inner mitochondrial membrane in response to treatment by fatty acids in the diet. So I basically did a lot of literature research to work out what lipids are in a mitochondrial membrane. This is the membrane where we make all of our energy. And so there's like 90 different kinds of lipids there: phosphatidylglycerol, phosphatidylcholine, cardiolipins.
Can you name all 90 of them?
I can name most of them. And go.
Great.
So the interesting thing. So I started out with what's in an inner mitochondrial membrane in a rat's liver. And it turns out that Thomas Seyfried actually has done some of the basic research in this stuff, which was really kind of cool because I get to cite him in my paper, that's cool. Nothing to do with keto, just the guy.
He also expressed interest in coming to Keto Fest to speak.
Wouldn't that
be cool?
That is awesome. So he actually helped me a lot in the. I sent him an email and said, do you have any more information? And he put me in touch with all of the experts in mitochondrial membranes in the world. And so essentially what I did was I built a model of this membrane in a computer, and I simulated it over 30 microseconds to look at how the membrane moves, what kind of the membrane thickness, the area that's subtended by each lipid, and the diffusivity of the lipids. So basically, how they move around in the membrane. And I had 4 different dietary treated. I had data from a study that treated rats with different kinds of lipids. Dietary fats, and so one rat. There were basically 4 cohorts, 4 groups of these rats, and they were all given a 0-fat diet with fat added, and the fat that was added in each of the 4 cases was different kinds of fat. So one was safflower oil, nothing but safflower oil. So their diet was a low-fat diet with extra safflower oil added. And then the next group was a low-fat diet with olive oil added. And then the next group was a low-fat diet with fish oil added. And then the third was olive, safflower, fish oil.
You need a saturated fat.
One. Well, the fish oil was the only one that was saturated. They don't even feed rats saturated fat because, dietary guidelines.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there's a little bit of saturates in olive oil, I think, tiny bit. But anyway, yeah.
So there was two. So olive oil is mainly palmitic acid. I mean, it's mainly it's palmitic and oleic, so a saturated and monounsaturated fatty acid. Safflower, linseed. Linseed was the other one. So there was two plant oil diet. So safflower oil, which is 18,2 linoleic acid, and then linseed, which is lots of polyunsaturated omega-3s, and then fish oil, which surprisingly, fish oil had the most saturated fat. And then I realized, of course, it's an animal fat. What am I talking about? Of course, it has a lot of saturated fat. So anyway, the study will be coming out, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more about the actual biophysical changes. But the interesting thing was the baseline rat. So this is the rat that wasn't given any different dietary treatment, just regular rat chow. Mm-hmm. And the rat that had the low-fat diet with safflower, the properties were almost identical. So that tells us that a lot of the research into rats, these rats being fed safflower oil because it's a nice cheap oil to put in the diet, and suggests that if we're using these rats as a model for humans, then we may not be getting useful information from them because we're feeding them a really unusual diet that doesn't map to what we feed humans. And the interesting thing was what you eat ends up in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So this is inside all of your cells, inside an organelle in the cells, inside the outer membrane. There's the inner membrane that's this weird sort of alien membrane that is unlike any other membrane in your body. The fats that you eat in your diet end up in that membrane.
Yeah. So like for the basic person like me who's not sophisticated on some of this, I mean, you're talking about every cell of the body contains a mitochondria. The mitochondria is where your ATPs, if you remember your Krebs cycles, your ATPs are created. That's your basic energy being created in your cell. And it's the biggest thing inside of each of your cells. And inside the mitochondria is like this squiggly membrane. And it's a lot that squiggly. It looks like one of those sour fruits that's kind of rolled up like a ribbon.
Okay.
It's like a ribbon that's kind of like folds back on itself, right? And that's where the the electron chain, they pick up, the Krebs cycle happens and it picks up electrons. So, and it has long been, this is an area of research for Dr. Kate Shanahan, where she talks about how especially unsaturated plant oils, vegetable oils, but particularly linoleic and linolenic, which are the two major ones that you find in vegetable oils, that these are causing actually damage the mitochondria. They damage that membrane. That is her research, or her reading of the literature, I guess, and that it causes cell death. So I think this research is really important because you're getting right to this question.
Michael Eads also, right? Michael Eads also does research into how these oils cause insulin resistance.
He did a talk that was using information from Petro Dombrowski, who's an English vet who has the proton series of hypotheses talking about the kinds of fatty acids that we metabolize affecting reactive oxygen species and how that feeds back into generating type 2 diabetes. It was a fascinating presentation, but I don't think he's doing actual research into it. Yeah.
Okay. So can we assume that Mediterranean rats are the happiest rats? Probably not.
Because they're getting, they're producing they're the most efficient mitochondria, let's put it that way. Probably because they have oleic oil. Olive oil is oleic oil, and so that's not as that doesn't have as many double bonds. It's not as easily oxidized.
And fish oil, I would call that, right in the Mediterranean camp.
Those are unsaturated.
Yeah, fish oil has a lot of unsaturated fats in it.
It's mostly unsaturated. Yeah, but the thing I don't know, the clinical trials on fish oil have never been successful at showing that it can protect against heart disease. We're talking EPA and DHA. So those are the fish oils that you take in little capsules, and they've had, to my knowledge, 3 really large long-term clinical trials where they just couldn't show an effect, a protective effect of these fish oils. And I think the complicated thing about the literature is that there are some intervention trials, clinical trials that seem to show that when you eat fish oils as part of fish, so there's something about eating them in the context of the whole food, which
shocker,
that it does help. So, so I would say that it's and there's a kind of a interesting, ironic twist to all of this is that the people who are eating fish oils, if you're eating fish oils, the folks who manufacture fish oils have to go out and suck out of the sea all the tiny little fish like anchovies. This is what happens in Chile. I visited one of these plants where they just haul in all the anchovies. Well, what does that do? So it takes away the food source for the larger fish that people might eat. Not to mention the bird life, and it's sort of like the base of the pyramid of that whole ecological system. So it's really ecologically damaging, and it removes or it reduces the availability of fish.
Makes
larger
my
fish
Caesar
that
salads more expensive.
Right, which means you can't even get the food where you could actually benefit from those fish oils. Anyway, it's a mess.
It's because it's the same reason that we have linoleic acid in the food supply, because corn is cheap and soy is cheap. It's cheaper to harvest small little fish like this because they have more oil to everything else ratio than big fish. Big fish have less oil to lean mass than small fish. And the reason why fish are cold-blooded and they live in the ocean, which is colder than room temperature in the land for at least half the year, and fish to retain fluidity in circulation. You want in your membranes, you want to have more polyunsaturated fats at a colder temperature. So if you're a warm temperature animal, you can have a lot of saturated fat and butter will melt on a hot day. Butter won't melt in the ocean unless it's really warm. So the saturated fats are likely to stack and become less fluid, and so fish. It's all regulated systems, but fish create these extra polyunsaturated fatty acids, partly as a way to survive in like colder temperatures. So, but
So by that theory, I should be walking around like stiff and rigid from the saturated fats today. I can't bend my arm because of all these saturated fats.
Turn my blood to putty.
It's not just what you eat. You can also you can desaturate. You have desaturase enzymes that will take a saturated fat. If your fat's starting to get if the temperature's dropping and your fats are becoming too rigid, you have enzymes that will turn a palmitic acid or turn a stearic acid into an oleic acid by desaturating it, by taking from an 18.0 to an 18.1. So, it's we are magical biological systems with all these enzymes that regulate everything. So it's not just what, it's just.
That's the word that came to my mind. Magic. Body is just magic.
But we can't do everything. Like we can't take short term, like, when you get those omega-3 eggs in the supermarket and they've given them flaxseed or something in their diets, right? And those are shorter chain omega-3s. That's the shortest chain omega-3. Well, your body cannot. Most people have almost zero conversion of that shorter chain omega-3 into the longer chain ones. So your body can't do everything. I mean, it can't, like, it can do a lot with some of the raw material it has, but it can't change everything into what you need.
It's also not used to people shooting omega-3 into eggs.
Yeah, well, it's the feed, I think.
It's the feed,
right?
yeah. So
it's
if
the
you
feed and the chicken feed.
Yeah,
chickens are little dinosaurs. They will eat. They'll eat if you let them loose in the paddock. They will forage for bugs, and they will get a lot of long chain omega-3 fatty acids from eating bugs and the like. So it's a healthier egg to get a pasteurized egg than it will be to get one that's been fed linseed. Or even in Europe, you can get eggs that have been fed shellfish, that are too small for sale, and those eggs are quite high in longer chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. So their omega-3 eggs are slightly healthier than ones that have been created by giving chickens linseed to eat.
Well, speaking of non sequiturs, Nina, it's been a while since we talked to you about your work trying to get the U.S. government to change the guidelines, the dietary guidelines. And you've got a lot of infrastructure working behind the scenes. And, we've talked about it on numerous occasions. And it's been a couple of years, 3 years since we talked about it, 3 or 4 years. What's the latest?
Well, let's see. The Nutrition Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization that I run, is dedicated to trying to ensure that our nutrition policy is evidence-based, which means it's based on rigorous clinical trial science, and which is implicitly a statement about the fact that it's not currently based on rigorous clinical trial data. I think pretty much everything, every recommendation is based on predominantly observational evidence, which we know is a weak kind of data that shows association, not causation. So, and we focused on the dietary guidelines because they're so enormously powerful. They every day I learn more about how very powerful they are. They basically determine all of our country's feeding programs. So school lunches, programs for the elderly, feeding programs,
military.
For women and infant children, the military is required. I mean, all government agencies are required to follow the guidelines. And then they're just sort of considered the gold standard. So they're downloaded by dietitians, nutritionists, doctors, nurses. I mean, they're sort of, that's what's served in hospitals and in cafeterias. And so they're really influential. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, follows them. So just recently, we heard that the FDA came out with new requirement. They're voluntary requirements, but they're nevertheless, they're recommendations to the food industry to lower the salt content of all their foods, which will, I think it's fair to say, probably have a detrimental effect on health. Because if you look at the literature on salt, there's just, we can say that it's disputed science, but there's a large school of thought supported by quite a lot of data showing that if you eat too little salt, that your risk of poor cardiovascular outcomes, heart attacks, death, all of it goes up. So it just sort of what we think of as a J-shaped curve. Like there's a sweet spot of 3 to 5 milligrams, I think, of consumption of salt.
Of sodium.
Sodium.
So salt's double that. Yeah.
So sodium, so that if you go too high or too low, your risk of cardiovascular disease goes up. So that's it. That's just another non-evidence-based recommendation.
Before we get off that topic of salt, what I understand, and from talking to people like Dr. Fung and who's a nephrologist, a kidney doctor, so the kidneys are, primarily what was filtering out salt in your urine. For those people who are metabolically healthy, the kidneys flush salt, and so you need more, right? And for those who are typically following the standard American diet, salt tends to be held in the kidneys. Is that right? The kidneys don't flush salt?
The hyponatremia of starvation, so people on low-carb diets will tend to flush more sodium, so they need to eat more salt. But, people on a high-carb diet, they retain salt, and so...
right. And so it's kind of, it's like a chicken and egg thing, to use the metaphor.
Well, the study that Nina was talking about, the Pure study, was in 18 countries, 250,000 people, and they didn't look at they didn't correlate the salt intake with the types of diets, whether these people were on lower or higher carbohydrate diets.
Right.
I think that would have been interesting. I mean, I would have loved to have seen Salim Yusuf's study sort of quantized by carbohydrate availability in the diet to work out whether, the people who were on a low carb diet who had a high or low salt intake were particularly susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So that would have been interesting, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, the number of people eating low carb diets is still probably relatively low in most countries. And so capturing that in observational studies has just not really been possible yet that I can see. I mean, there's been an attempt, I think, a little dishonestly to take some observational data, like from the 70s, or looking at the nurses' health study out of Harvard, and say, we're looking at just the low carb people, but there weren't that many low carb people. And then they define low carb as like 40% of calories as carbohydrates, which is not a low carb diet. So
that's ridiculous.
So I don't think you can get, I mean, maybe now in the United States, if you were to take a sample of people, you could get, if you got enough people, you could have a true low carb sample. But in most of these, when we're talking about study countries around the world, they're very, you're not going to go to Malaysia, I don't think, and find a keto population there.
Right.
You might find a meetup group. But anyway, so I think that...
but people eating carbs, probably should limit their salt because they've already got too much in their system. This is what I'm saying. And this is the fad diet.
Much, so yeah.
What's interesting about Dr. Yusuf's work is his work is not just, that data is not just from the Pure study. There are multiple studies that have found that same J-shaped curve in terms of response to sodium. He says that no matter where you go, people pretty much they have a very strong homeostatic response, and they in other words, they just eat the amount of salt that they need.
Yeah.
So they eat, almost everybody in the world, no matter what you tell them, they're eating what they need. Their body somehow senses it, and they eat it. I mean, they eat their food suddenly tastes, like it needs salt, and they put salt on it,
right.
Or they avoid something salty. So it's kind of astonishing, actually, how powerful that is, because we certainly don't do that with a lot of other things in our diets.
Well, if you think about it, we're one of the only intelligent animals that have the conscious ability to say, I think I would like X, whereas, bear doesn't eat leaves because he's worried about cholesterol,
Right. Thank goodness. Bear
it tastes good.
Doesn't get the Harvard Health newsletter.
Yeah.
So, so back to the dietary guidelines. So what happened, the last thing, really the big thing that happened, is that the last iteration of the guidelines came out at the end of 2020. And they were, I would say, pretty much the same, kind of sort of disappointment. So, the same, they even though the expert committee recommended reducing the level of sugar down to 6% of calories, the current cap is 10% of calories as sugar, and the expert committee recommended lowering it down to 6% of calories, and the USDA, that expert committee hands over their scientific report to the staff at USDA and HHS. That's the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services, two agencies that co-issue the dietary guidelines, and they rejected that recommendation. So, and they rejected it, not with any explanation, but, my speculation, it's just a speculation, but the USDA especially is, there's a tremendous amount of influence from the food industry in that agency. I mean, just to give you a sense, they have a partnership with PepsiCo to serve, to package and serve stuff to kids at lunch, like, crap potato chips and all kinds of things that are just highly processed, crappy foods. I'm sorry to use the word crappy. That's not really.
I would use stronger
highly
language.
Processed foods, and they have a partnership with Domino's Pizza to provide pizza to, and they work with Unilever. So they're an agency, and this has been recognized since the very start, of the guidelines in 1980, where they said, "Look, you're an agency that your goal is to promote American foods." And at the same time, you're telling people to restrict some foods over other foods. So they have this kind of conflict in the agency. The agency runs all these feeding programs. And so it really probably does make sense to partner with some of the big food companies to provide foods to, all the schools across America that they need to feed. But in any case, those companies clearly have strong sway at the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Otherwise the bottom of the pyramid wouldn't be grains.
Yeah, I mean, one of the top people in the guidelines at USDA, she came straight out of the Corn Syrup Association, and so I mean,
how does anybody in the Corn Syrup Association sleep at night? Seriously,
yeah.
Do we need corn syrup?
Do you know where she is now? She's the head of the a little, not very well known, but very powerful, the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils, which is the trade group that makes all the vegetable oils in the world.
Yeah. Crisco. She's Big Crisco now.
She's Big Crisco. Yeah.
That's a rap name.
It's Crisco time. So the guidelines were not, so I would say that, let me just give you some other highlights of them. So they were supposed to review the low-carb diet for the first time in the history of the guidelines. Right. They said, and you really can't make this stuff up, they said they could only find one clinical trial on low-carb diets. And that was a study that had, as an author, one of the members of the Dietary Guideline Expert Committee. So you couldn't really ignore her study.
That was
But every other study, they said they couldn't find. Whether it was due to their search criteria that somehow was designed to exclude all low-carb studies.
Clearly, they don't listen to two keto dudes.
Yeah, they don't listen to two keto dudes. And I will tell you that there were something like 4,000 unique public comments that were submitted during this process, according to a paper I just read. And I know that because of work that our group did, that probably about 3,000 of those came from our members, people who follow us on social media. I mean, we collected thousands of them from people saying, we feel very strongly about the guidelines. We don't believe they're right. So it's not like they're not hearing about, they're not hearing it. They know these studies exist. The majority of people who stood up and gave public testimony at one of their meetings were low carb doctors, low carb, success stories, I guess. So they know about this, and the literature was submitted to them by a new advocacy group called Low Carb Action, who actually formally submitted to them all of the low carb studies that would meet their criteria. So that was just a shocker. For them, it's like it is such an overt suppression of science to say we just don't see it. We don't see the science.
They've got their fingers in their ears and they're going la 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 la.
Right.
That doesn't work. So another really extraordinary thing about the guidelines is that they are truly only for healthy people. They're not for people who have been diagnosed with any diet-related disease. And that was something that came up during the process. And our group talked about how can we have a guidelines? The Congress has stated that they must be for the quote unquote general public. A report by the National Academies of Medicine said we need to really emphasize that these are for the general public. The general public, 60% of America at least now has been diagnosed with one or more diet-related chronic disease. If you look at that study from out of University of North Carolina that was based on government data, 88% of Americans have some kind of metabolic disease. So, we have these guidelines that really don't apply to everyone.
We got to find that part of the population that isn't sick and make them sicker. That's what we do at the government.
It's our
We're here to help.
And, meanwhile, like you think about like the poor kids in school, say now, this recent sample that was sampled for this study I mentioned earlier on COVID, something like 62% of the kids are overweight or obese in this Hispanic population they sampled. Those kids are going to public school and they're getting a diet that is not designed for them. I mean, to put it lightly.
Not designed for healthy people. Yeah. Not
designed for healthy people, but like technically not designed for them. They did not even review the science. They don't look. So here's another weird thing they do. They say, we look at the science on people with obesity and diabetes, but in order to fulfill their mission of prevention only, right? They're only looking at prevention. So they will take a study on obesity, but they won't look at the primary outcome of that study. In other words, they won't look at the outcome that the study was designed to study.
Yeah.
They'll only look at secondary and tertiary outcomes, which the study was not designed to look at.
Clearly, they're cherry
picking.
picking.
It's not well powered for,
And it's not well powered for, and that's why they're doing that to somehow to say we're looking at this literature, and they can say it now. But what they're not saying is like we're looking at this literature, but we're ignoring the most important results.
Do companies like Virta have any influence with the guidelines more than, a coalition of concerned citizens and scientists?
Not that I know of. I don't think they're involved in advocacy work.
And their studies would have been rejected because they're not blind.
Randomized.
Yeah, double blind. Right.
No, it was randomized.
They were open label, but I think they were randomized, weren't they? But they were open label, so.
I think people chose their diets, which would be considered non-randomized.
You're also relying on the people who in the study to report correctly what they eat.
Well, that's common in clinical trials. That wouldn't.
Oh, really?
That wouldn't boot out a clinical trial.
But the Virta stuff was they would actually measure circulating blood ketones every day. So in the app. So that one of the strengths of Virta, and one of the reasons why Stephen Phinney makes the claim that they have some strength that beyond randomization is that they're testing dietary
markers.
They're testing dietary adherence by seeing if they're making circulating ketones. If you're making greater than 0.3 millimoles per liter of ketones, then you are, by definition, on a low carbohydrate diet. So.
Right. I think there's also another argument to be made, which is, so first of all, they could, if they had known, call it a cluster randomized trial.
Yes.
Because it was in the same way that PREDIMED, the famous Mediterranean study, was cluster randomized, which means you're randomized by your village, basically, or and that's pretty much what Virta did. They took the people in West Lafayette, Indiana, did it one way, did one thing, and the people elsewhere did something else. But they didn't know to call it cluster randomized. But I think but to me, a more controversial yet more compelling point to me is that it better reflects the real world where people choose their diets. So people choose a diet because they want to follow it. And it's highly unlikely that, so in a properly randomized study that, somebody who wants to go low carb, if they're randomized to a vegan diet, it's highly unlikely they're going to really follow that diet. People adhere to the diet that they want to try. And it's a very different thing to want to try a low carb diet versus a vegan diet, which are maybe two of the top options out there right now. So in some ways, the trial reflects the real world condition of selecting your own, dietary or new lifestyle choice. So anyway, I think it's an argument that could be made, particularly in diet trials, because it's such a personal choice. And one of the problems that diet trials all have is that people won't stick to them. They don't feel compelled. I think if I were in a diet trial, it would be hard for me to feel compelled to stick to a vegetarian or vegan diet. And they have very low adherence. They can't, Virta had very high adherence. Anyway, obviously there's it's a whole complicated thing about how you get people to adhere to a diet. But just getting back to the guidelines, I want to tell you just one other thing, which is that the review on saturated fats was really a fascinating review because that little subcommittee looking at saturated fats was led by somebody named Linda Van Horn, who has spent, I think, a 50-year career trying to prove that saturated fats are bad for health. She worked for many years with Jeremiah Stamler, which some of you will recognize as one of Ansel
the
Keys'
sugar guy
closest buddies. No, it wasn't Stamler. That you're thinking of Hegstead, I think.
Oh, I am.
But
sorry. Yeah.
Stamler was from University of Chicago, a cardiologist, but he worked quite closely with Ansel Keys for a long time. Anyway, he's virulently against saturated fats, as is Linda Van Horn, who is put in charge. So a highly biased person put in charge of this subcommittee, really with no one to counterbalance her. There was, I looked at that committee in close detail, and there really was nobody kind of on the other side of the issue. There was a woman who did consulting work for vegetable oil supplements, and I'm forgetting who else was on there. But it was a small and biased subcommittee, and they initially, I know from sort of inside information, they wanted to drop the current saturated fat limit, which is 10% of calories, they wanted to lower that down to 7%. And there was one member of the Dietary Guideline Committee, Jamie Ard, who said, really, do we need saturated fats at all? Why don't we just go down? Who's to say it shouldn't just be 0? And which is such a ludicrous thing to say, just in this, saturated fats are in every food that we eat.
They're in mother's milk, which is literally
right. So except for
food.
Sugar, I think sugar is the only thing that doesn't contain at least some saturated fatty acids. So I think that when our group was active in pulling together really top scientists, including 4 former Dietary Guidelines Committee members. So people who had written the expert reports that underpin the guidelines, going back to 1995, there was somebody from the 2015 version, they're issued every 5 years. And they wrote a paper. They got together and we supported a meeting for them, but they themselves then got together, wrote a paper that came out as a quote unquote state of the art review in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is a very prestigious journal,
yes. Mm-hmm.
Quite esteemed, read by cardiologists who are considered to be pretty conservative on this issue. And that paper said there's insufficient evidence to continue caps on saturated fats. And it dealt with the LDL issue. I mean, it's a really amazing paper. Let me just say one more thing about it. It was named one of the top papers, one of the 5 top papers of the year by the editor-in-chief of that journal. So, and that group also went and talked to high-level officials at HHS and USDA, and they formally submitted public comments through the formal public comment system, and yet none of that was considered by this subcommittee. I mean, they ignored all the science and all the evidence submitted by this group.
There is one thing that happened in 2019 that, and I'll just mention it quickly. The American Heart Association declared cholesterol not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption.
That was from the 2015 dietary guidelines, right? That was the big thing in 2015 was that fine cholesterol was no longer
I got the date
wrong.
Yeah. The AHA did precede them by a couple of years. I think the way they did it was hilarious, where it was not in the press release. It's not in the summary of the paper. It's nowhere in the paper, buried. Except for there's a table where, they're listing and the evidence for them, and it lists dietary cholesterol. And in the little box, if you go down, it just says insufficient evidence. That's it.
Right. That's
not
it.
a single line of the paper, nothing. This whole new, our new lifestyle. And, that had been a cornerstone of dietary advice going back for the American Heart Association, going back to 1961. So they just sort of tiptoed themselves out of that one. And then the dietary guidelines dropped in 2015. Interestingly, we now are in a situation where they did another review of dietary cholesterol, and they came out this time, so this is 2020, saying insufficient evidence that dietary cholesterol is harmful for your blood cholesterol, right? Yet, in their classic way of it's like Kafkaesque double speak. They say a healthy dietary pattern is lower in cholesterol. Based on observational evidence, even though they reviewed the more rigorous evidence and found found it to be insufficient, they went back to their weak observational evidence and said, and really without any, and it was just language put in there. It wasn't the result of any scientific review, and said that, a dietary pattern tends to be lower in cholesterol. And so that's what they can point to. If you say, you no longer have cholesterol caps, they'll say, but we have this language.
Isn't consumption of dietary cholesterol going down too?
It has been over the last decades, because we eat, I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, something like 30% less meat than we did red meat than we did from 1970 to 2015, I think, where consumption of red meat's gone down by more than 20%. Consumption of eggs went down by almost 20%. Consumption of butter went down by about 20%. So we should be getting healthier.
You would think.
It's so strange. What a paradox. I wonder what could explain it.
I wonder. I mean, it's the whole saturated fat thing is ridiculous on its face, because in the conclusion paragraph of the Pure study, they said there's no valid reason to keep dietary recommendations on saturated fat limits, because they showed that there was no association with cardiovascular incidents, and in fact there was a negative association with stroke. So the more saturated fat you eat, the less stroke you have. So, I don't understand how they can continue. So
they excluded the Pure study, because they said that we're only including studies that are on basically, first world nations, I forget the language they use, but, wealthy countries that are more representative of our population. Even though the U.S., if you look at our health statistics, we're way down there, far below most industrialized nations. But so they excluded the pure study on that basis. They didn't look at that evidence. But actually in a more recent paper, so one of the things that I did this year or the Nutrition Coalition did this year, is that we helped develop a special issue in Nutrients that was all about dietary guidelines. And they're really amazing papers and great authors. And if there's a link in your show, I'd love to include it. But there's one that's very comprehensive and talks about all the evidence and why a low carbohydrate diet should be just one dietary pattern that's offered by the USDA. The USDA, the dietary guidelines has what they call 3 dietary patterns: U.S. style, Mediterranean, and vegetarian, and they're pretty much the same. But but this paper argues you should add low carb to those dietary patterns, add a 4th dietary pattern, and here's all the evidence for it. And here, it's a really excellent paper. It was led by Jeff Volek from the Ohio State University. There's a paper on sodium that was the first author is Andrew Mente, and that includes Salim Yusuf. That's sort of a whole overview of all the debate on sodium and where the evidence lies. And then there's a paper on saturated fats that I'm an author of. One of the authors, which I'm happy about. And that also is it's a great group of authors. And one of the things that we did, which is really interesting, is that was new to the literature, is that we actually looked at the review that Linda Van Horn and her, that dietary guideline committee had done. We looked at their systematic review. I tallied up all the papers they had looked at and said, all the papers and whether they had positive or negative outcomes for saturated fats, right? Did saturated fats cause heart disease in this paper? What was the finding? Yes, no, yes, no, yes. And it turns out that something like 85% of all the papers had no finding. In other words, either they had saturated fats did not cause heart disease, or the more saturated fats looked better. So this is 85% of the papers that don't support their conclusion. In other words, their conclusion does not represent their data. So we have a little table on that. That's pretty interesting. It shows overwhelmingly that all the studies they reviewed on stroke show that the more saturated fat, the more protective your diet is. That's something that the Pure study found, but that's not the only study that's found that. There's maybe 5 or 6 papers that have found higher saturated fat is associated with lower stroke. So anyway, it's really just tells you that there are bizarre ongoings in terms of the science, like ignoring the science, reviewing science, and then concluding something to the exact opposite of what the science shows. I mean, it's really pretty stunning.
Is it corruption?
What goes on to make those guidelines?
Would you call it corruption?
I don't know if there's an easy word to pin on it. I think that they are very attached to there's probably a lot of cognitive dissonance. There's probably a lot of bias to maintaining the existing guidelines and not changing them. There's a lot of food interest for sure in that. And that may be the dominant force. But they may not want to flip-flop on the public and be accused of backtracking and potentially opening themselves up to lawsuits.
Yeah.
I really don't know exactly what are the most dominant forces, but they're definitely not conducting science by any of the rules as we know them or understand them, or the international community understands them. Yeah. And our group is a little bit of a plug. We're the only watchdog group in the world really looking closely at national nutrition policy, and especially our national nutrition policy. You can't find it anywhere else. We did things like we did transcripts of all the public meetings, publicly available transcripts, and they then deleted all their public meetings off their website. So you can't even get them They didn't publish transcripts until weeks later. I don't even know if those are available on their websites anymore. And I don't know if I would trust them to actually to accurately reflect the conversation, which had a number of embarrassing statements. Like one of them being, don't you think, we don't offer any advice about weight loss, and given the obesity rates in America, don't you think we need to explain a little bit more to America why we're not offering any advice on weight loss? That was the question somebody raised. Don't you think? Anyway, we're really the only watchdog group really just monitoring the process and seeing what happens and understanding where the science has not been rigorous.
Your group is the most important in the world, and the reason is that all of our dietetic guidelines are based on the results of the American dietary guidelines. I mean, we're not going to redo all of that research. We're not going to spend all the money to redo the research.
We being Australia,
it's already been done in English in Australia. I mean, and I assume in England and Canada and New Zealand and the rest of the English-speaking world, if it's already been collated for us in English by a reputable organisation, so a watchdog that is holding that organisation to account. Even if it's even if the degree to which you can hold them to account is limited by their inability to change course, it's an important role that you're doing. So I thank you for that.
I hope so.
I submitted to your dietary guidelines as a biochemist, citing my references, and then I did the same in Australia. And I've been ignored in 2 countries. So
well, that's the thing. No, I mean it's going to take something more than just they sort of tout the fact that they have these open public processes and they take input from the public. But then they just ignore it. They obviously just ignore it. So, and they ignore the letters and they ignore the write-ins. And it's obviously going to take something greater. I mean, we've made a real start, I think, in just sort of opening up this area for discussion, getting a lot of media attention, quite a bit. But it's just going to take more. I think it really will take more political power. It'll take more to make this a really central issue in the country. I mean, you'd think like with 88% of people having metabolic disease and the tremendous cost that in terms of human suffering, but also the financial cost of the country, you'd think that there would be more incentive to really address this. But the forces on the other side are huge. I mean, you've got big food, big pharma, and well, that's enough. But there are other forces behind them.
Well, I mean, you've got 2025 now, so you've got 4 years now to get some purchase. You've got a lever long enough. Now you just need a fulcrum to rest it against. So, that's it's a big job. I don't envy you the task, but I wish you the greatest of success.
As do I.
It's necessary. We have nobody else. There is nobody else standing on this parapet. And so, it's very important what you do. So, don't feel disheartened that you're not getting the results in the first 5 years. I know that you'll be still there in 15 years pushing. Oh, yeah. And,
I think the group will still be there and I'll definitely be involved in some way. Sure. I may no longer be the director of it. I think that personally, I am going to try to do more writing and more journalism, write another book. And I'm actively fundraising for the Nutrition Coalition because I think that the group needs to live on. Absolutely. There's no question. There's just no group like it. And this policy has to change because, until it has like vise-like control on all of our nutrition recommendations and what people think is a healthy diet. So, it has to change.
By the way, if you go to Google or Bing and type in Nutrition Coalition, the very first thing you get is an ad called Coalition Nutrition Official for lifters by lifters, and you have products. That's not you. So it's nutritioncoalition.us. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we want to encourage our listeners to support the Nutrition Coalition. It's probably the most important thing that you can do if you are woke about the benefits of a low carb diet and the detriment of the standard dietary guidelines. And donate. Do it now.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else on your mind that you want to talk about before we hit the big red button?
Well, I'll just mention the one other paper that is in this series in the Nutrients special issue, which I think is a great paper that everybody ought to know about, which is by a Danish group of researchers, and it's on processed meat and cancer. As we all know, the WHO and specifically an agency in that called IARC declared in, I think it's 2015, maybe a little bit later, that processed meat was a probable cause of cancer.
Yeah,
and they did that
like smoking, right? I mean,
smoking.
The press,
right.
the nutrition press said it's just as bad as smoking to have processed meat, and I want to know exactly how many cigarettes.
And if you have smoked processed meat, well, that's even worse.
Yeah. If you rolled up your salami like a cigarette,
it's hard to light, though.
So that pronouncement was based entirely on, as I think people know, on observational studies. Again, they can show association, but not causation. The process ignored a couple of clinical trials that found to the contrary. In other words, people who had reduced processed meat did not see a reduction in their risk of cancer or actual cancer. And this is for colorectal cancer. And then the relative risks for people who understand that about observational studies were for processed meat were 1.18, where the number 1 means zero association. So, I mean, that's just tiny, 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 tiny. In other words, like it's so small as to be non-existent. But anyway, the IARC made this decision. Many people consider it to be flawed. But what this paper does is super interesting, because that it takes all the observational studies on processed meat and colorectal cancer, and they run them through this, basically through the tests that you're supposed to apply to observational studies. Is there bias? Is there, have they accounted for confounders? There's just like a number of things. They use something called the grade method, which is a way of grading data, right? It tells you about the quality of the data. And at the end they found something like 130 papers, 22 of them actually met the criteria. In other words, they actually had the methodological rigor that's required. And 20 of those were actually on cancer. And they found those papers did not find an effect of processed meat on cancer. And in fact, the more rigorous ones showed, as particularly on cancers of the digestive system, showed a kind of reverse effect, like that meat may be good for you. So in other words, the more rigorous, so it was really sort of saying, look, we're going to take out the good evidence here and see what the good evidence, the rigorous evidence that actually meets qualitative standards. What does that evidence show? Right. Objective qualitative standards. What does that evidence show? So when, so it's a great paper. I mean, it's very clear, and it just says, we sorted through the data according to proper, internationally recognized standards of data rigor, and this is what we found. Anyway, it's a good paper, and we can link to that too if you like.
We will.
We definitely will. Well, Nina, it's been great catching up with you, and I can't wait.
Well, great catching up with you guys.
Can't wait to hang out in October 2022 at Keto Fest.
All right, if not before. Maybe we'll see you. Okay. Great talking to you.
Thank you.
And seeing you. All right, take care.
Heard you say you're due for a little.
So, Carl, you know how we have this new segment called Malarkey?
Yeah, so you say. I miss bullshit, man.
Well, I decided to change the name because calling it bullshit was going to make it more difficult for our listeners to share it with their families.
But are we still going to talk about bullshit?
Oh, yeah, it's full of bullshit.
Well, I'm good not saying bullshit on the pod then and calling it malarkey instead, as long as we both agree it's all bullshit.
Right. This malarkey is 100% bullshit.
It's a good thing we're not going to say bullshit anymore. We're getting it out of our system. So what malarkey do you have for us today?
Today I want to talk about the cause of type 2 diabetes and post hoc logic fallacies.
That's different from type 1 diabetes, right?
Yeah.
Diabetes organizations tell us that type 1 is an autoimmune disease often happening to juveniles, and there's some genetic component.
Right. It used to be called juvenile diabetes, and most people afflicted with type 1 came into contact with some pathogen that they made antibodies for, and those antibodies, however, got their wires crossed, and then instead of just recognizing some proteins on the pathogen, they had an affinity for either the patient's insulin proteins or the beta cell in the patient's pancreas that make insulin. So you have a bad flu, and then a couple of weeks later, you're unable to clear glucose from circulation, glucose goes sky high, and then you start running on fat, and ketones go sky high, making your blood acidic. And if you don't diagnose the problem quickly, it can be really fatal.
Yeah, I recall episode 59 from 2017, talking to Ian Kelly, my friend, and while he couldn't prove it, he said that he went to the doctor for like just a regular antibiotic, for a tick bite, and then doxycycline or something like that, and then 30 days later, he basically learned he had type 1 diabetes. And there's the 30 days was a magical number, I think. If it was, the doctor said usually it takes 30 days for type 1 diabetes to express itself. What happened 30 days ago? And it was to the day that he had that shot. So but that's not the kind of diabetes we have, right? Type 2 diabetes is a lifestyle disease, right? Don't we do that to ourselves by eating too much and not exercising? And eventually we get obese and then we get type 2 diabetes. Isn't that what the diabetes organizations tell us?
Oh, that right there is the first bit of malarkey.
Malarkey.
That's a classic case of the post hoc ergo propter hoc logic fallacy.
What?
That's the fancy Latin name for it, but the English translation is after and therefore because of. It's when you see two events happen and you assume that the one happened first must have caused the second one.
Right.
So let's say you hear a rooster crow every morning and a few minutes later the sun comes up. You might assume, well, that rooster is able to cause the sun to rise. But if you think about it, there could be another explanation. Maybe the rooster has better eyesight than you and can see the faint approach of dawn while to you the night is still black. Well, in that case, the rising of the sun causes the rooster to crow.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, or that might be one powerful damn rooster.
Exactly. And in this case, the rooster's crow is obesity occurring before your doctor notices you're diabetic.
Yeah.
But because we can see obesity sometimes 5 years before doctors notice our blood glucose rising, well, then it's a natural mistake to conclude that obesity must cause type 2 diabetes.
So what is causing type 2 diabetes then if it's not obesity?
Well, an American Army pathologist named Joseph Kraft looked at blood tests from 14,000 individuals and discovered, well before glucose rises, sometimes a decade before, insulin rises. And because we traditionally don't look at insulin because it's a fiddly immunoassay test that's really quite expensive, we don't notice because to really see the results, you have to take a sequence of 5 of these insulin tests every half an hour after a challenge meal. But we can easily and cheaply measure glucose. And when that rises a decade later, now we have a clear diagnostic signal for type 2 diabetes.
So we are literally like the drunk looking for his keys under a lamppost because that's where the light is good for seeing, despite losing them somewhere else. Does that mean that it's a change in the insulin response to a meal that causes high glucose 10 years later?
Right, and it causes obesity 5 years later. So chronologically, obesity occurs 5 years before a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, but it doesn't cause it. This rooster does not summon the sun.
Oh, well, I didn't like that rooster anyway. So how does insulin cause obesity?
Insulin, as you know, is the master regulator of energy substrate. It tells our cells what fuel to use. When insulin is high, we burn glucose and we make fat. And when insulin is low, we burn fatty acids and make ketones. So Dr. Kraft was able to see patterns in the secretion of insulin after a meal that predicted whether somebody would become a type 2 diabetic 10 years later. When you eat a meal, insulin goes up to tell your cells to use glucose first, and once the glucose drops, insulin goes low to tell your cells to burn fatty acids. The difference between a type 2 diabetic and a non-diabetic is that the type 2 diabetic makes way more insulin and it stays up for much longer. So type 2's ability to switch from glucose to fat is not as flexible. Your non-diabetic friends, after eating the exact same meal, may be back to normal in 2 hours, whereas your insulin may be elevated for 6 hours. And because we've all been trained to eat 3 meals a day plus mid-meal snacks, we could have an elevated insulin all day.
Well, that is some malarkey.
Yes, it sure is. Because it means that we're making fat all day and not burning fatty acids. If your meal is 50% fatty acids and 50% glucose and you can't burn fatty acids, then you'll only have half the available energy from your meal. What do you think that causes?
I reckon that might make you want to eat snacks between meals to get more of that glucose.
Right, you end up eating more calories because only half of your meal in that example can be turned into calories that you can use for energy, and half of it can only be stored.
So I see how this process could cause obesity, but that doesn't explain how your glucose rises a decade later. I've heard of a theory called the personal fat threshold, and this is where you keep putting on body fat until your body fat can store no more calories. And then that fat overflows into your circulation and some magic happens because insulin wants to get energy out of circulation, and then glucose goes up.
Personal fat threshold is total malarkey.
Oh!
That comes from the observation that not everybody who is obese gets type 2 diabetes, and not everybody who gets type 2 diabetes is obese. So let's say that you really, really, really want to hold on to your bias that type 2 diabetes must be a lifestyle disease, that type 2 diabetics must be doing it to themselves by becoming fat first. You need to come up with a reason to explain why some people don't get fat first and some people get fat and don't get diabetes. So you have to invent some special property of humans that determines at what level of obesity they get diabetes, since you're wedded to the idea that fat causes diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
So first you need to invent some new biochemistry about insulin's role being to clear energy from circulation. By the way, that's not how any of this works. You should never have too much or too little energy in circulation. That's kind of the point of having a circulatory system, to move energy from tissues that store it to tissue that use it. Insulin's primary role is to switch from cells running on fat to cells running on glucose. Anyway, their theory goes that you get fat first by eating too many calories and that fat has the most calories. Remember, this is the dogma, so you have to start with this. Eating too many calories causes diabetes. So once you get fat, your fat cells fill up, and then there's some personal fill line that's unique for each person, and once you get past that, fat overflows into your circulation. Then your pancreas notices that, and it says, wait, there's all this energy hanging around, so we need to make an extra dose of insulin. But your fat cells are already full, so they release more fatty acids. And now your pancreas makes more insulin, and your cells get tired of hearing about that insulin signal all the time, and they get resistant, and now they won't transport glucose because they're insulin resistant.
Mm-hmm.
But in that scenario, you need someone overproducing insulin to be getting fatter and fatter because their fat cells are insulin sensitive and then suddenly becoming insulin resistant once they hit capacity, and then you get diabetes, high glucose and high triglycerides. But what this model cannot explain is that people who are overproducing insulin have high triglycerides for the entire journey, not just once the fat cells overflow.
And triglycerides are extra fat in lipoproteins floating around in your bloodstream, looking for a place to go.
Yeah, the reason our circulation is full of fatty acids isn't because we are eating too much fat, but because we aren't burning fatty acids.
Right.
We can't pee out fat. The only way to get rid of it is by turning it into energy. Yeah. And that's what a type 2 diabetic is. Someone inhibited from using fatty acids for energy because their insulin is elevated.
Yeah. Well, okay, but why does glucose suddenly go up after a few years of being inhibited from burning fatty acids?
Well, the reason's complex, but essentially fatty acids back up when they're not being burned. They're stored locally in the cell in lipid droplets, in circulating triglycerides, and in fat cells. And the reason glucose goes up in the latter stages of this is that those cellular storages of fatty acids, the lipid droplets, they compete with glucose transporters for a membrane fusion protein called SNAP23.
Oh, snap!
Snap. So essentially, the more lipid droplets in your cells, the less glucose transporters you can get to fuse with the cell membrane to import glucose. Glucose in circulation rises, and so our pancreases make more insulin, further inhibiting you from burning fatty acids.
Yeah, in software, we'd call that a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, it's a horrible way to control the system, but all you have to do to release the inhibition on burning fatty acids is to lower insulin, and you can take control entirely away from this positive feedback loop.
So if you're a type 2 diabetic, you can reverse your disease by keeping your insulin as low as possible, and eventually you'll get control of your glucose and lose some weight. And a ketogenic diet is the most sustainable way to chronically lower insulin. So I guess the answer is keep calling keto on.
And that's no malarkey.
Hey, thanks for listening.
We hope you get as much out of this information as we do in putting it together.
And you know, as I said before, Two Keto Dudes doesn't take advertising revenue. We have no benefactors with hidden agendas.
That's right. It's listeners like you who keep our lights on.
And there are a few ways you can support us, all of which are listed on our website at donate.2keto.com.
Thanks again.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time on Two Keto Dudes.